The wind screamed across the Wind River Range. Snow fell thick, swallowing every track on the Wyoming plain. In the white nothing, a lone wooden ranch house stood silent under the mountains. One window glowed, faint in the dark. Inside, a man sat by the cold coffee in his hand. He stared into the night where the snow never stopped. Then came the knocking. 3 steady knocks, not desperate, not rushed. The man set the cup down, took the rifle from the wall, walked to the door, listened to the wind and the breathing on the other side. He opened it. She stood in the blizzard as if she had risen from the snow. Her lips were dark with cold, but her eyes were completely alert. No fear, no begging. Only the sharp, measuring look of someone who had already decided what this door was worth. He stepped back. She walked inside. The wind came before the snow. It always did. It came down off the Wind River Range, like something that had been waiting all summer to say something terrible. It hit the valley floor and kept going. Through the fence posts, through the barn walls, through the gaps in the window frames that Rafe Colton had been meaning to seal since October and hadn't. He hadn't done a lot of things since October, since Clara. He stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand and watched the sky turn the color of old iron. The kind of color that meant 3 days minimum, maybe 4. The horses would need extra feed. The water trough would freeze by morning. The north pasture fence had a weak post he'd been ignoring since September. He'd been ignoring a lot of things since September, since Clara. He set the coffee down, pulled on his coat, went to work. That was how Rafe Colton lived now. Not by wanting things, not by planning things, but by moving from one task to the next. Before the silence in the house could catch up with him. Coat on, boots laced, door open. Move, because if he stopped moving, the house would remind him. The second chair at the table. The curtains she'd made from flour sacks one winter when they had nothing else. The way the floorboard by the stove creaked at a pitch that somehow still sounded like her voice saying his name, Clara. He'd learned not to stop. He learned it the hard way. 3 days after the funeral, he'd sat in that kitchen chair and hadn't moved until Doc Haskell came out to check on him. Hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. Just sat there with her coffee cup still on the shelf where she'd left it. Doc Haskell had looked at him for a long moment, set a hand on his shoulder, and said exactly nothing because there was nothing to say. That was 3 years ago. The cup was still on the shelf. He still didn't stop moving. He fed the horses in the dark, all 5 of them, working down the stalls with the lantern, throwing long shadows across the hay. Pepper, Dutch, the 2 mares with no names he'd bought from a Shoshone trader in September. Because the ranch needed working horses, and he needed something to do with his hands. And at the end, Ghost, Clara's horse, white as the weather coming. Still the calmest animal he'd ever known. Ghost pressed his nose into Rafe's palm and breathed. Rafe stood there longer than he needed to. Yeah, he said to the horse. To no one, I know. He went back inside. The wind had picked up while he was in the barn. He could hear it now, finding every weakness in the house. The loose shutter on the east side. The gap under the back door. The chimney drawing wrong, because the wind was coming from the northwest at an angle that always gave the flu trouble. He added wood to the fire, chicked the window latches, sat down with a new cup of coffee and a ledger he wasn't going to read. Outside, the snow finally started, slow at first. Then, not slow at all, he heard it at 9:30. Not the wind, not the house settling, something else. He sat up straight, put the ledger down, listened. There was again knocking. Not frantic, not desperate. 3 solid knocks, evenly spaced. Like someone who had decided very carefully whether to knock at all. Like someone who understood that knocking on a stranger's door in a blizzard was a thing you only did if the alternative was worse. Rafe was at the door with his hand on his rifle before the 3rd knock finished. He stood there for a moment, just listening. Wind. Snow against glass. The fire behind him. And underneath all of it, the specific silence of a person standing still on the other side of a door. He opened it. She was standing in the snow like she'd grown there. 25 years old, maybe. Apache, from the shape of her face and the cut of her clothing, deerskin worn thin at the elbows. Moccasins soaked through, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders that had stopped being useful sometime in the last hour. Her lips had gone dark with cold. Her hair was loose and full of ice. But her eyes were completely, utterly alert. Not frightened, not begging, watching him the way a hawk watches the ground, measuring, calculating, deciding, even now, whether this was a door worth walking through. She said, "I need shelter, just that. Then, I will work for it." Rafe looked at her. Looked past her into the dark where the snow was coming sideways and hard, and the tracks she'd made were already filling in. She'd come from the direction of the ridge, on foot. In this, he looked back at her face, at the set of her jaw, at the way she was not swaying even though she should have been. He stepped aside. She walked through the door. He didn't ask her name right away. She didn't offer it. She stood in the middle of his kitchen and let the heat hit her and did not make a sound about what that must have felt like. After however many hours she'd been out there, just stood, breathing, her eyes moving across the room in that same careful way. Door, window, fire. The rifle he'd leaned against the wall when he stepped back to let her in. She clocked the rifle, looked at him. He looked at the rifle too, then back at her. Neither of them said anything. He pulled a chair close to the fire. She sat. He put the coffee pot on without asking whether she wanted any, because the question seemed absurd given the circumstances. He found the extra blanket from the chest by the stairs and set it on the table within reach but didn't hand it to her, because she didn't look like a woman who wanted things handed to her. She took it, wrapped it around her shoulders without looking at him, which meant she trusted him enough to look away, which meant something. He poured the coffee, set it in front of her, sat down across the table and picked up the ledger again, even though he still wasn't going to read it, because she needed to not be watched right now. She needed to warm up and drink the coffee and breathe, and having a man stare at her across a table while she did those things would be its own kind of cold. He'd learned that from Clara. He thought about most things through the lens of what Clara had taught him. He tried not to think about that. The coffee was gone in 3 minutes. She held the empty cup with both hands. Just held it, like the warmth was something she could keep. He refilled it without a word. She looked up at him then. Something shifted in her face. Not softness exactly, more like recalibration. Like she'd set certain expectations when she knocked on that door, and he was doing something that didn't match them. "Why, she said. He looked up from the ledger. "My name, Rafe," he said. She nodded once, looked back at the fire. He looked back at the ledger. The wind hit the house hard enough to make the shutters crack. The fire jumped in the grate and steadied. Outside, the snow kept coming. And in the kitchen of the Colton Ranch, 2 strangers sat on opposite sides of a table and did the careful work of not asking each other anything yet. It was the blanket shifting that made him see it. She moved to adjust it around her shoulders, and the deerskin of her left side pulled tight, and the firelight caught the cloth wrapped around her rib cage. Dark cloth. Darker in one place than the others. Not mud, not water. He'd seen enough injuries in 20 years of ranch work to know what dried blood looked like. What a wound wrapped in a hurry looked like. What a cut made by something thin and deliberate looked like, as opposed to the ragged tears you got from falls and wire fences. Someone had put a knife in her. Someone had done it cleanly, which meant someone who knew what they were doing. Someone gotten close enough to do it, which meant either she'd trusted them or they'd taken her by surprise. And someone had done it before the blizzard hit, which meant she'd been walking, bleeding, through the early hours of this storm. For God knows how long before she'd ended up on his porch. He set the ledger down. "Let me see it," he said. She went very still. "Your side," he said. The wrapping. She looked at him for a long moment. That hawk look again, measuring the distance between what she needed and what trusting him would cost. Then she loosened the deerskin at her left side. The cloth underneath was wrapped tight, already pulling at the edges of the wound. He could see the stiffness in how she moved, the careful way she'd been compensating for it since she sat down, the way she breathed shallow on the left side. He went to the shelf where Clara's medical kit still sat. He hadn't opened it in 3 years. He opened it now. "This is going to hurt," he said. "I know," she said. She looked straight at the fire while he worked. Didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. He cleaned the wound and wrapped it properly, and the whole time she sat, like she was somewhere else entirely. Not dissociated, not gone, but gathered into some interior place where pain was just information and information didn't require a reaction. He'd never seen anyone do that before. He tied off the bandage. "You should have said something when you came in," he said. She looked at him. "Would it have changed what you did?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "Then it didn't matter," she said. He couldn't argue with that. He gave her the room at the top of the stairs, Clara's sewing room. The one that had never been a bedroom, but had a cot in it, from when Clara's mother visited that first winter before the woman decided Wyoming was no place for a person of her sensibilities and went back to Ohio and never came back. The room smelled like dried lavender and cedar and the particular dusty quiet of spaces that had been closed off too long. He put a lamp in there, extra blankets. Left a pair of wool socks outside the door because her moccasins were ruined and he didn't have anything else. He didn't sleep much. Sat by the fire until the early hours, listening to the wind work itself into a fury against the walls, doing the math on what her wound meant, and what the direction she'd come from meant, and what those two things together meant. She'd come off the ridge. The ridge ran northeast to southwest along the edge of his property, and beyond it was another 20 miles of nothing until you hit the small settlement at Crane's Fork, which wasn't a town. Just a trading post and a few buildings that had grown up around it, stamed for the family that owned most of the land out that way. The Aldridge family. He looked at that thought for a moment, then he looked away from it. The way you look away from something bright when you're not ready for what you'll see if you look straight at it. He went to bed at 2 in the morning. By 5:30, he could smell coffee. She was in the kitchen. She'd found the coffee and made it. Found the pan and made biscuits. Thin ones, Apache style, without the leavening Clara always used, cooked flat in the iron skillet. Found the salt pork and sliced it thin and had it crisping at the edge of the pan. She moved around his kitchen with the careful precision of someone who understood she was using another person's things and was being exact about it. Not one item out of place. Not one unnecessary motion. She had tied her hair back. She wore the same deerskin because she didn't have anything else. But she moved differently than last night. Easier. The wound still constrained her, but she'd found a way to work around it. He stood in the doorway watching her for a moment. She said without turning around, "Coffee's ready, so." She'd heard him on the stairs. He sat down. She put a cup in front of him. He noticed she'd used the plain cup, not the one on the shelf. Clara's cup. She either hadn't touched it or had looked at it and understood what it was and left it alone. Either way, he drank the coffee. She sat down across from him with her own cup, and they ate the biscuits and salt pork in the same silence they'd established the night before. Comfortable and uncomfortable at the same time. Like two people who've been walking the same trail in opposite directions and have just noticed they're going to have to navigate each other. After a while, she said, "What needs doing today?" Not a question. A statement. She was going to work. She'd told him she would, and she was going to. Fence post in the north pasture, he said. Water trough. Barn roof had a weak board go last week. Needs patching before more snow. She nodded. The wound, he started. Will hold, she said. He looked at her. It will hold, she said again, in the tone of someone who has had the final word and knows it. He drank his coffee. Barn roof first, he said. The horses need it. She stood up and took her plate to the wash basin. Barn roof first, she agreed. They worked well together. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected to have to show her things, explain the setup of the ranch, where tools were kept and how the barn was organized. But she watched once and had understood. Didn't ask unnecessary questions. Didn't work slower than the task required or faster than the conditions allowed. When he needed a second set of hands on the roof patch, she was already holding the timber from the right angle. When he needed to move around her, she moved before he said anything. She read the work the way she'd read him. Quietly, carefully, always one step ahead in the calculation. The wound pulled on her when she climbed. He could see it in the set of her left shoulder, the way she favored her right side going up the ladder. But she didn't say anything. And if he had said something, she would have looked at him with those measuring eyes, and he would have found he had nothing to add. The snow eased off in the late morning. Not stopped, just eased. The sky went from black-gray to gray-white. The temperature didn't rise, but the wind died down enough that they could hear each other without shouting. During a break, she stood at the edge of the barn and looked northwest. At the ridge, he watched her watch it. "How long were you out there?" he asked. She thought about it. "Since the morning before last." He did the math. 30-some hours. In December. In Wyoming. "Wounded? Alone?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He nodded. Looked at the ridge himself. "You came from past Crane's Fork." It wasn't quite a question. She turned to look at him. Something shifted in her face. Not fear. She didn't seem to do fear in any obvious way. Something more like wariness taking a specific shape. "Yes," she said. He let it sit there. She didn't add anything. He went back up the ladder. 5 days into the cold, the sky broke just enough. He needed supplies. The biscuit flour was running low. The salt pork was nearly gone. He had enough coffee for another week, but the horses were going through the feed faster than usual in the cold. He saddled Dutch and rode to Ridgefall. Ridgefall wasn't much. A general store, a post office that doubled as a telegraph office, a livery, a doctor's office, a saloon that also served as the courthouse. When Judge Calloway came through 3 times a year. Population of 47, depending on the season and who you were counting. He tied Dutch outside Pemberton's general store and went in. Harlan Pemberton was behind the counter. 50-something, suspicious of most things on principle, but fair about prices. "Colton," he said. "Harlan," Rafe said. "Flour, salt pork, extra horse feed." Harlan wrote it down. Started pulling things from the shelves. Rafe looked around while he waited. Habit. There was a board by the door where notices went. Sales, missing livestock, town meetings. He'd looked at that board 1,000 times. He looked at it, now, and stopped. It was a new paper, white against the weathered wood, printed, not handwritten, which meant it had come from somewhere with a proper press. The illustration at the top was a rough sketch, but detailed enough. A young woman, Apache, high cheekbones, dark eyes, hair loose. He read the text, "Wanted, for theft of documents and property belonging to Aldridge Land and Cattle CO female, Apache, approximately 25 years of age. Last seen in the vicinity of Crane's Fork, Wyoming territory. Reward, $200 upon delivery to Victor Aldridge, Crane's Fork, or to any officer of the law. $200. He looked at that number. He looked at the sketch. He thought about the way she'd stood in his doorway. The way she hadn't begged. The way she'd said, "I will work for it," like it was the most natural transaction in the world, and she was used to earning every single thing she ever got. He thought about the knife wound. He thought about the direction she'd come from. He thought about who lived in Crane's Fork. He reached out, took the notice off the board, folded it, put it in his coat pocket. Harlan Pemberton looked at him from behind the counter. Rafe looked back. "You going to say something?" Rafe said. Harlan put the flour on the counter. "Nope," he said. Rafe paid, loaded the supplies, rode home in the cold. She had mucked out 2 stalls, rehung the broken gate on the chicken coop, and started a pot of something on the stove that smelled like sage and rabbit. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the pot on the stove, and then at her, and then back at the pot. "Where did you?" "Rabbit, not venison. Sage in the pot from your shelf." She stirred without looking up. I should have asked. I didn't ask. I'm asking now. It's fine, he said. Is it? Yes, she looked up then. Something in her expression that might have been the beginning of something lighter. Not quite a smile. More like the shape a smile would take if it decided to happen. He pulled the notice out of his coat pocket, set it on the table, didn't say anything. Just set it there between them and stepped back and gave her room to look at it. She looked at it a long time, long enough that the pot started to simmer and she didn't touch it. Then she looked up at him. $200, she said. Yes, that's a lot for a rancher alone. Her voice was careful. Watching him again, measuring. But underneath the measuring, something. A thinness, a held breath. He sat down at the table, reached across and picked the notice back up, turned and put it in the fire. She watched it catch. It says you stole, he said. But it doesn't say what or why. Does that matter to you? He thought about that. Thought about the wound, about the ridge, about a woman walking 30 hours through a Wyoming blizzard, alone, and the only thing she'd said when she arrived was, I will work for it. It's the only thing that matters to me, he said. She looked at the fire for a long time. He got up and stirred the pot. It's rabbit, he said. Not venison, I know, she said. I caught it. You don't have to explain yourself. I wasn't explaining. I was correcting. He turned back to the pot. Behind him, he heard her pick up the spoon, which was answer enough. She didn't tell him that night, or the next day, or the day after that, and he didn't ask. They settled into a rhythm the way the ranch itself had a rhythm. Not because anyone decided it, but because work required it. She was up before him, fire going, coffee on, whatever needed doing in the early hours already done. He came in behind her on the bigger tasks, fence repair, splitting wood against the next storm, checking the cattle in the south pasture. She worked without being asked, and without being thanked in any explicit way, which she seemed to prefer. He started to see her system. She never wasted emotion. She never used two words where one would do. She moved through his kitchen and his barn and his property with a practicality that had nothing to do with efficiency, as he understood it. It wasn't about doing things fast. It was about doing things right, about not taking more than was needed. Once he watched her pick up a tool, use it, and put it back in exactly the same place he'd taken it from. He hadn't told her where things went. She'd watched him the first time and remembered. Once he watched her stand at the edge of the north pasture, with her eyes closed and her face turned slightly into the wind. Not resting, listening. She opened her eyes, looked at the sky to the northwest. Another storm, she said. 3 days. He looked at the sky. Saw nothing obvious. How do you? The wind shifts a certain way before a big one. It smells different. She looked at him. Your fence post in the east field, the one you said needs a new brace. He'd mentioned it once. 4 days ago. It needs to happen before the storm, she said. He looked at the sky again. Nothing he could see. All right, he said. They fixed the fence post. 2 days later, the storm came. Bigger than the first. He didn't forget that. The storm kept them inside for most of 2 days. He found things to do. She found things to do. The house was big enough that they could do them without being in each other's way. But not so big that you could forget there was someone else in it. He hadn't forgotten there was someone else in it. He also hadn't talked to anyone in weeks before she showed up. Harlan Pemberton at the general store didn't count. Doc Haskell hadn't been out since October. He'd been living in his own head for so long that the presence of another person, the simple physical fact of someone else breathing in the house, moving in the next room, existing in a space that had been his alone, was strange in a way he was still adjusting to. Strange wasn't bad. He wasn't sure yet what it was. The second night of the storm, he came down late because the fire had gone low, and he wanted to add wood. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned down and a cup of something in her hand. Not doing anything. Just sitting. He added wood to the fire. She didn't move. He should have gone back upstairs. He didn't. He sat in the other chair. The one that had been empty for 3 years. He sat in it without thinking about it, and then noticed what he'd done, and then decided it was fine. "You're not sleeping," he said. "I sleep eventually." She looked at the fire. "I'm not used to walls," he thought about that. "How long since you've been inside?" She looked at the cup. A while, a while. He let that be what it was. A while could mean weeks. A while could mean longer. He didn't push. The fire had settled into a good steady burn. The storm hit the house and the house held. He could hear the wind finding the chimney, and he adjusted the flue the way he always did, and it quieted. "I've been inside this house alone for 3 years," he said. Not sure why he said it. She looked at him. "My wife," he said. "Clara. She died 3 winters ago." He looked at the fire. "I don't talkin' about it usually." "Why are you talking about it now?" He thought about it. "Because you said you're not used to walls. And I've been too used to them. Seems like information that belongs in the same room." She looked at the fire too. A long time passed. The storm outside. The fire inside. 2 people, on opposite sides of what they hadn't said yet. "My name," she said finally, "is Waya. It means wolf in my language." She turned the cup in her hands. "My grandmother gave it to me. She said I had a wolf's way of watching things. Of knowing before I should know." She wasn't wrong, Rafe said. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile. Smaller than that, but real. He filed it away without meaning to. The almost smile. It happened rarely enough to be worth noticing. "She's gone now," Waya said. "Quiet. Everyone is gone now." He didn't say he was sorry. It seemed like what everyone said, and she'd probably heard it until the words meant nothing. Instead, he said, "That's a lot to carry." She looked at him. Something in her expression that was more honest than most things he'd seen on people's faces. "Yes," she said. "It is." They sat by the fire till it burned down. Then they both went to bed. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Rafe Colton did not sit alone until the fire went out. He went to bed at a reasonable hour. He lay in the dark and listened to the house, the wind, the boards settling, the faint sounds of someone else in the room at the top of the stairs, and felt something he didn't have a name for. Not happiness. He wouldn't have said happiness. Too large a word for something this small. More like the specific absence of a particular kind of quiet. The quiet that isn't peace. The quiet that is just the sound of one person in too much space. He lay in the dark and listened to the house not be entirely empty. Fell asleep before the fire went out. On the northwest ridge, the wind had turned again, coming from a different direction now. Carrying new weather. Waya would have known what that meant. He was starting to learn. The morning after the storm broke, he rode to Ridgefall for the second time. He told himself it was for the flour. They were genuinely low on flour. But he also wanted to see if there were more notices, if there was news, if someone had come through asking questions. The answer was yes. There were 2 more notices now. And Harlan Pemberton had a look on his face when Rafe came in. A careful, slightly sideways look. The look of a man who knew something and hadn't decided yet whether to say it. "Aldridge men came through yesterday," Harlan said. Once the other customer in the store had left, Rafe kept his face still. "That's so. 3 of them. Asking about a woman. Apache." Young Harlan stacked tins without looking at Rafe directly. "Said she'd taken something that didn't belong to her." "What did you tell them?" "That I hadn't seen anyone." Harlan paused, which was true at the time. Rafe looked at him. Harlan looked at the tins. "Victor Aldridge owns half the land between here and the Shoshone border. You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand. People here have business dealings with him." Harlan finally looked at him. "I'm not saying what's right. I'm saying what is." Rafe put his money on the counter. "Flour," he said. "Salt pork. Horse feed." Harlan started pulling the order. After a moment he said, quietly, "Doc Haskell was asking about you. Said you should come by when you're next in town." Rafe loaded his supplies. "Tell him I'll come when I come," Rafe said. He rode home faster than he needed to. She was in the barn when he got back. Working, restitching a broken harness with a needle she'd found in Clara's sewing kit. Her hands were steady, and the stitches were small and even. Better than his would have been, he said. 3 men came through Ridgefall yesterday, asking about you." Her hands didn't stop. 1 stitch. 2 stitches. "They'll be back," she said. "I know, 3 stitches. 4. "You should know what you're holding on to," she said, still without looking up. "What it will cost you. I know what it'll cost me." "No." She set the harness down. Looked at him straight. "You don't. Not yet." A pause. "They don't just want me. They want what I have." He waited. She reached under the worn edge of her deerskin and pulled out something folded many times. Papers, and underneath them, a piece of hide with marks on it. She unfolded them carefully, set them on the top rail of the stall. He looked. Maps. Handwritten. And papers with signatures. The kind of signatures that meant something legal. "Victor Aldridge," she said. "He came to my people's village in the fall, presented himself as a trader. He was mapping the land, measuring. My grandfather saw what he was doing and refused to deal with him. Aldridge left." She touched the corner of one of the papers. "He left these behind. Or he left them somewhere. He thought no one would find them. I found them." She looked at Rafe. "They are contracts. Contracts that transfer land. Apache land. The land my people have lived on for 3 generations. To Aldridge Land and Cattle Company. Signed with names that are not real. Authorized by men who had no authority to authorize them." Rafe looked at the papers, at the signatures, at the survey marks on the map. "He was taking your land," Rafe said. "He was already taking it." She folded the papers back with careful hands. 2 weeks after he left, they came at night. Men with guns and fire. I was on the ridge. I go to the ridge sometimes to think. When I came back, she stopped. Her hands were still. I came back, and the village was burning. The barn was quiet, except for the horses shifting and the wind high up in the rafters. I ran, she said. With these. Because without these, there is no proof of what he did. And without proof, she looked up. Without proof, it becomes a story that only one side gets to tell. Rafe looked at the folded papers in her hands. He thought about Victor Aldridge. Thought about the men in Ridgefall asking questions. Thought about the legal-looking notices with $200 printed at the bottom. He thought about a woman alone on a Wyoming ridge, watching her home burn. He called them stolen, Rafe said. They are his documents, she said. He is correct that I took them. He is not correct about anything else. Rafe was quiet for a moment. Then, how long ago was the village? 6 weeks. 6 weeks. 6 weeks she had been moving, surviving, wounded, carrying those papers. In October. In November, December, and the worst blizzard Rafe could remember in years. You've been out there 6 weeks, he said. Yes. He looked at her, at the papers in her hands, at the talisman on her wrist. He'd noticed it before. Bone carved into a feather shape, worn smooth from years of handling. The kind of object that means more than it looks. He's not going to stop looking, Rafe said. No. Having those papers makes you a problem he has to solve. Yes, he picked up the harness she'd set down, looked at her stitching. Even, tight, better than his would have been. He hasn't found you yet, Rafe said. She looked at him. So we have time, he said, to figure out what to do with them. The silence stretched. We, she said. He set the harness back down, looked at her straight. We, he said. Victor Aldridge arrived on a Tuesday, which was almost polite. Almost like a man who believed in the social contract. Almost like a man who would knock before entering and wipe his boots on the mat and keep his hands where you could see them. Almost. He rode in from the South Road, alone. 1 horse. No weapons visible, which was its own kind of weapon. He was 52 years old, and he had the kind of face that photographs well and means nothing. Smooth. Controlled. The face of a man who had spent decades deciding what other people would see when they looked at him. He tipped his hat when Rafe walked out to meet him. Actually tipped it. Mr. Colton, he said. Victor Aldridge. I don't believe we've met formally. We haven't, Rafe said. He stood at the edge of the porch. Didn't come down the steps. Didn't invite the man up. Just stood with his arms loose at his sides, and his face saying exactly nothing. Aldridge looked at the barn, at the house, at the fence line. The way a man looks at a property he's calculating the value of. Hell of a winter we're having, Aldridge said. Yes, Rafe said. Heard you had some trouble with your north fence last week, which meant he'd been talking to someone in Ridgefall. Which meant Ridgefall was not as uninvested in this situation as Harlan Pemberton had implied. Fixed it, Rafe said. Aldridge smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't touch the eyes because the eyes are doing something else entirely. I'll come to the point, he said. I'm looking for a young woman. Apache. She was in the vicinity of Crane's Fork about 6 weeks ago and then simply disappeared. He spread his hands. Reasonable. Baffled. Just a man trying to find a missing person. She took something that belongs to my company. Documents. Important ones. Haven't seen her, Rafe said. Aldridge looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the house again. At the second set of boot prints in the snow alongside the porch. At the lamp in the upstairs window that Rafe had not thought to extinguish this morning. At the 2 coffee cups he'd left on the porch rail before Aldridge rode in, because they'd been watching the sunrise, and he'd forgotten to bring them back inside. 2 cups. Rafe did not look at the cups. Neither did Aldridge. Well, Aldridge said, in the tone of a man who has filed information away for later. If you do happen to come across her, the reward stands. $200 is considerable for a man running a ranch alone in winter. I'll keep that in mind, Rafe said. Aldridge nodded. Put his hat back on. Turned the horse around, stopped. Beautiful property, he said, without looking back. Your wife's family land, wasn't it? Before she passed, Rafe went very still. Terrible thing, Aldridge said. A man alone. All this land to manage. Things can get complicated out here. Title disputes. Boundary questions. He finally looked back. The smile was still there. I'd hate for a neighbor to run into that kind of trouble. He rode south. Rafe stood on the porch until the sound of the hoofbeats was gone. Then he turned around. Waya was standing inside the door. She'd watched the whole thing from the front window. She'd seen the cups too. He could tell by the look on her face. He already knows, she said. Yes, Rafe said. He was telling you what it will cost you. To keep me here. Yes. She looked past him at the road where Aldridge had gone. He came alone, she said. Which means he doesn't want witnesses yet. Yet, Rafe said. Yet, she said. They stood in the cold doorway and looked at each other. Tell me everything, Rafe said. From the beginning. All of it. She took a breath. Sit down, she said. It takes a while, she told him at the kitchen table. Coffee between them. Fire behind her. Her hands flat on the table, not moving, because Waya used her hands the way she used words. Only when necessary. Aldridge had come to her people's land the previous September. The Wind River country, 50 miles northeast of where they were sitting right now. He came with 2 men and a wagon of trade goods. Flour, blankets, metal tools. And he was charming in the way that people who want things from you are always charming at first. Her grandfather had seen through it in about 3 days, but by then Aldridge had already walked the land, already taken his measurements, already had his quiet conversations with the men who worked for him, about the creek line and the mineral deposits, and the grazing range that extended for 20 miles in every direction, without a legitimate homestead claim on it. Apache land, traditional land, land that had been her people's before any deed office existed to record it. He came back twice more, Waya said, with papers each time, asking my grandfather to sign, presenting them as agreements, trade agreements, partnerships. Her mouth tightened. The paper said something. What did they say? Land transfer, full title. To Aldridge Land and Cattle Company. She looked at her hands. My grandfather refused. He told Aldridge to leave and not return. And he left? He left smiling. She paused. He left his papers behind. Or he believed he had, but I had found them the day before, in the saddlebag of one of his men. I took them. I hid them. 'Cause you knew, I suspected. She looked up. A man who smiles like that when he is refused, he has already planned what comes after the refusal. He thought about that. About the smile Aldridge had given him at the gate. 2 weeks later, Waya said, I was on the ridge. I go there at night sometimes, to think, to watch the stars." She stopped. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. "I saw the fire from up there. I heard the sounds. The kitchen was very quiet. I ran toward it," she said, "and then I understood there was nothing to run toward. And so I ran away from it instead." Her fingers pressed flat against the table. "With the papers. Because without the papers there is no evidence. There is only a woman who survived something that leaves no witnesses, and a man in Crane's Fork who owns everything around it and will say whatever he needs to say." Rafe looked at her hands on the table. He looked at the talisman on her wrist. He thought about the knife wound, about the fact that she'd been running for 6 weeks, about the fact that she'd shown up on his porch not begging, not breaking, just steady and measuring and saying, "I will work for it," in a voice, and was not already decided what dignity was. "The knife," he said. "That was Aldridge's men. One of them caught me on the second day. I got away, a beat. He did not." Rafe looked at her. She looked back. "Steady, he's alive," she said, in the tone of someone answering a question that hadn't been asked yet. "Injured. I left him tied to a tree with his own belt." Rafe processed that, decided he had nothing useful to add to that information. "The papers," he said. "Where are they now?" She reached under her deerskin, pulled out the folded packet, set it on the table between them. He didn't touch it. "Just looked at it. Is this enough?" he said. "To do something with legally? If someone with authority reads them," she looked at the packet, "a judge, a federal marshal. Someone who cannot be bought by Aldridge or frightened by him. Ridgefall gets a federal judge 3 times a year," Rafe said. "Judge Calloway. Next visit isn't until March." "March," she said. "March, 2 months. Give or take." She looked at the packet on the table. He looked at it too. 2 people sitting with a stack of paper that could end a man's operation or get them both killed. In a kitchen in Wyoming in December, with 2 months, until anyone with the power to act on it came within reach. "All right," Rafe said. "All right," she said. Neither of them said anything else for a while, but she picked up her coffee cup, and he picked up his end. The fire kept going, and outside the wind did what Wyoming wind does in December, which is remind you that the world doesn't care about your problems, but the fire does. And the fire was enough for now. The cold deepened in January the way it only can in Wyoming. Not just cold as in temperature. Cold as in the land itself going somewhere else for a while. The creek froze solid. The sky went white instead of blue. The shadows on the snow turned purple at dusk. And by 5 in the afternoon, it was dark enough to need a lamp indoors. They worked through all of it, because the ranch didn't stop for anything. Not grief, not weather, not danger. The cattle still needed feed, the horses still needed water, the barn still needed mucking. The fence line still needed checking, because the cold made the wood contract, and weak posts could give. And if cattle got out in this temperature, they could be dead before you found them. They developed a system, not a spoken system, not a negotiated system, just the system that emerged when 2 competent people work alongside each other long enough. He took the heavy physical work, splitting wood, hauling feed bales, repairing anything structural. She took the livestock care, the barn, the daily checks. They switched when the other was occupied or when a job needed 2 pairs of hands. She taught him things. This surprised him. Not that she knew things he didn't. He'd figured that out in the first week. But that she taught them without making a performance of it. Just mentioned something, showed it once, moved on. The way she pressed her, palm flat to the ground before checking on cattle to feel vibrations, before she could hear movement, the way she read the steam from the horse's nostrils to gauge their temperature without a thermometer. The way she tied a knot in the fence wire that held better than the knot he'd been using for 20 years. He started using her knot. She noticed, didn't say anything, but he caught the corner of her mouth again. He was definitely watching for it now, which was a thing. That was a thing he was doing. He tried not to think about it too hard. There were evenings when the work was done, and they had nowhere to be but the kitchen. He found himself not minding that, which was different, which was new, which was something he needed to think about, and simultaneously something he had no idea what to do with. So he mostly just didn't think about it. Did the dishes, added wood to the fire, let the evenings happen without trying to name them. She talked more in the evenings, not dramatically more. She was not a dramatic talker. She said things when she had things to say and was quiet when she didn't, which Rafe had come to understand was a gift and not a withholding. One evening, she told him about her grandmother. The one who had given her the talisman. She was very old, Waya said. Old enough that she remembered a time before the treaties. Before the agreements that meant nothing, she turned the talisman on her wrist. She was also very small and very loud. She had opinions about everything. About the fire and the weather and the men in the village and the way young people didn't sit still long enough to hear what the land was saying. Rafe looked up from the harness he was making. She sounds like she was a lot. She was everything, Waya said. Simply, a pause. She used to say, put the talisman down when you find where you belong, not where you're staying. Where you belong. She looked at the carving. I've never put it down. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. Which was the right call. Another evening she asked him about Clara. Not how Clara died, not the facts of it. Something more specific. What did she love? He set down what he was doing, thought about it. Thunderstorms, he said. She loved thunderstorms. She'd go out on the porch and just stand there, getting rained on, like it was something she'd been waiting for. He looked at the fire. She loved the horses, Ghost especially. She picked him out herself from a herd that was mostly browns and grays, and she walked straight to the white one. He paused. She loved a good argument. She was never wrong. Not about important things. Waya was quiet for a moment. She sounds like she was someone who knew what she wanted, she said. She was, he said. She always knew. I was the one who took longer to figure things out. A log shifted in the fire. She was lucky, Waya said, to have someone who kept figuring things out. He looked at her. She was looking at the fire, her profile in the firelight. The talisman catching the glow. He looked back at the fire too, and didn't say anything about what was happening in his chest, which was something he wasn't ready to name, and might not be for a while. And that was fine. There was time. There was January and February and March, and the slow arrival of a judge who could actually do something. There was time. He told himself that. Doc Haskell came out on a Thursday. Rafe had been expecting it. Harlan Pemberton had passed along the message twice now, and Doc Haskell was not a man who gave up on things. He was 65 and had practiced medicine in Ridgefall for 30 years, and had buried more people than he liked to count, including Clara. And he had the specific bluntness of someone who has watched too many people die from things that could have been prevented if someone had just said the difficult thing out loud. He pulled up in his wagon, climbed down with the careful deliberateness of a man whose knees were not what they once were, and looked at Rafe with the expression he reserved for patients who were not following instructions. You could have come to town, he said. I'm busy, Rafe said. Doc Haskell looked at the house. I'd like some coffee. They went inside. Waya was at the kitchen table, working on the papers, not the legal documents, but notes she'd been making in her own language alongside them, an index of what each document said. She looked up when they came in, looked at Doc Haskell, assessed him in approximately 2 seconds. Doc Haskell looked at her, then at Rafe, then back at her. Well, he said, that explains quite a lot. Waya poured him coffee without being asked, which Rafe had noticed she did for people she'd decided were all right, and which was the fastest positive verdict he'd ever seen her reach. Doc Haskell sat down. He was quiet for a moment, drinking his coffee, looking at the papers spread on the table. Those are Aldridge documents, he said. Yes. Waya said, he's been asking around town about them. About you. He looked at her directly. He told Sheriff Pell you stole from him. I did, she said. From the man who burned my village." Doc Haskell looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression that was neither pity nor surprise. Something older than both. "I know what he did," Doc Haskell said quietly. Rafe looked at him. Wyatt looked at him. "I was treating a man in Crane's Fork that fall," Doc Haskell said. "One of the land surveyors Aldridge brought in. He was not a well man, morally speaking. But he was sick and sick people talk." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "He told me what Aldridge was planning. The land. The people on it. What would happen to them when the papers were ready to file." He stopped. "I should have reported it. I told myself I had no proof, that it was a sick man rambling." He looked at the table. "That was not a decision I'm proud of." The kitchen was quiet. "What happened to the surveyor?" Rafe said. "Left Crane's Fork before the winter." "I don't know where." Doc Haskell looked at the documents. "What's in those papers?" "Enough," Wyatt said. "If a judge reads them." "Calloway comes in March," that's what Rafe said. "Aldridge knows Calloway's schedule too." Doc Haskell looked at Rafe. "He'll move before March. If he thinks you have something on him, he won't wait for a courtroom if he can prevent a courtroom from happening." Rafe thought about the two cups on the porch rail, about the way Aldridge had looked at them and said nothing. "How much time do we have?" Rafe said. Doc Haskell shook his head. "I don't know. A week, 3 weeks. Depends on how scared he is." He looked at Wyatt. "Those are real," she said. "His signature, Sedge, his dates, his surveyor's marks." She met Doc Haskell's eyes. "I know what I took. I know what it proves." Doc Haskell sat with that. "All right," he said finally. He set his coffee down. Looked at Rafe. "I'll tell you what I know in town. Who can be trusted and who can't. Pemberton's loyal to himself, but he's also fair, which is almost the same thing out here." He paused. "Deputy Greer is complicated." "Complicated how?" Rafe said. "He's not a bad man. He's a frightened one." "There's a difference." Doc Haskell picked up his hat. "Frightened men can go either way." He stood up. Wyatt walked him to the door. At the threshold he stopped. Looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what happened to your people." She looked at him for a moment. Measured him the same way she measured everything. "Be useful," she said. "That matters more than sorry." He almost smiled. "Yes," he said. "I think you're right." He climbed back into his wagon, drove north toward Ridgefall. Rafe and Wyatt stood on the porch and watched him go. "He's good," she said. "He is." Rafe said. "He feels guilty. He should." A pause. "So do I. This is 50 miles from my ranch and I didn't know." She looked at him. "You couldn't have known. Someone should have known." He looked at the road. "Someone always knows. They just decide it's not their problem." She was quiet for a moment. "You opened the door," she said. "In the blizzard." "That is knowing enough." He looked at her. She had already turned back toward the house. The trouble with Ridgefall started on a Monday. He rode in for supplies and Pemberton wouldn't meet his eyes. The man behind the counter at the feed store, a young man named Dietz, who'd always been fine before, found 3 reasons to be busy when Rafe walked in and then told him the order wasn't ready and to come back Friday. Come back Friday, he'd ordered 4 days ago. He went to the post office. The woman there, Mrs. Crane, no relation to the Fork, just the name she'd been born with, took 2 steps back when he came to the window and handed his letter over so fast. She didn't even wait for him to sign for it. He walked back to Dutch and stood for a moment. Looked at the board outside the general store. 3 notices now. Bigger than before, the reward had gone up $250. And underneath the reward notice, a newer piece of paper, a statement, signed by Victor Aldridge. Witnessed by 2 men whose names Rafe didn't recognize, claiming that Rafe Colton of the Wind River Basin was knowingly harboring a fugitive and obstructing a lawful investigation. His name. On a public board. In Ridgefall, he read it twice. Looked at it the way you look at something that has changed a situation permanently. The way you look at the evidence that something you thought was only coming is already here. He took it down, folded it, rode home. He told Wyatt about it. She read the notice. Didn't change expression. Folded it back the way he'd folded it. "He's telling the town you're the problem," she said. "Yes." So that when something happens to you, they'll think it was your own fault. Yes. She set the notice on the table. I should leave, she said, not as a statement of what she wanted. As a statement of logic. No, he said. Rafe. No, he looked at her directly. If you leave, he wins. He gets the land. He gets the story. He gets to say whatever he wants with no one left to contradict him. A pause. And he'll find you eventually. He's not looking for you because of the documents. He's looking for you because you exist. Because you survived. She looked at him. He hadn't meant to say that last part. But it was true, and she knew it was true, and pretending otherwise seemed like a waste of what little time they had to think clearly. If you stay, he said, we have a chance. If you go, he stopped. If you go, I'll spend the rest of the winter wondering. Wondering what? He looked at the table. At the notice, whether I should have done something different, he said. Whether I could have. She was quiet for a long time. That's not a reason, she said finally. Not for you to risk everything. Maybe not. He looked at her. But it's mine. A log shifted in the fire. She looked at her hands. At the talisman. I'm not good at owing people things, she said. Good, he said. Because I'm not offering to be owed. She looked up. Then what are you offering, she said. He thought about it. For real. Not a quick answer. The real one. A place, he said, to stop running from. Instead of two, the kitchen was very still outside. The January wind moved across the roof. The fire held, the lamp held, and across the table, Waya looked at Rafe Colton for a long moment with those measuring eyes of hers. And then she looked away, but not before he'd seen something in her face that hadn't been there before. Something that might be the beginning of believing. Deputy Greer came on a Wednesday evening, alone. No horse. He'd walked out from Ridgefall on foot, which was 4 miles in the cold, and was either stupidity or an indication that he very much did not want anyone to know he'd been here. Rafe saw him, coming up the road from the kitchen window. Someone's coming, he said. Waya was beside him in 2 seconds. Looked, badge, she said. Deputy Greer. Rafe watched him. Doc Haskell said he was complicated. Should I go upstairs? He thought about it. No, he looked at her. I want him to see you. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. Rafe opened the door before Greer had reached the porch. The deputy was 38 years old and looked 50. Not from age, from something heavier than age. He had the look of a man who'd been carrying something for too long and had stopped being able to tell where it ended, and he began. He stopped at the base of the porch steps, Mr. Colton, he said. I'm not here officially. I can see that, Rafe said. You walked? Yes. Greer looked at his own hands, at the badge on his coat. Then at Waya, standing just inside the door. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was complicated, not threatening, not unkind. Complicated. Come in, Rafe said. Greer came in. Sat at the table without being asked, which was the behavior of a man whose legs had decided before his pride did. Waya poured coffee. Set it in front of him. He looked at it. I know what Aldridge did, he said, without preamble. To the Apache settlement. Northeast, Waya went very still. I was in Crane's Fork when he hired the men, Greer said. 3 weeks before it happened. I heard the conversation. Not all of it. Enough. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. His knuckles were white. I said nothing. I told myself I wasn't sure, that I'd misunderstood, but you hadn't, Waya said. Flat. No, he said. I hadn't. Silence. So why are you here? Rafe said. Greer reached into his coat, pulled out a folded piece of paper, set it on the table. Notes, he said, from that day, the names of the men he hired, the amounts. What I heard, he looked at it. It's not signed testimony. I can't have a wife. 2 daughters. Aldridge has enough influence here that... He stopped. I'm not brave enough to stand in front of a judge. No, Waya said. You're not. He flinched. But you came here, she said. Tonight. On foot. Yes, why? He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd come in. Because what happened to your people? He stopped. Started again. There are things a man doesn't get to unknow. I tried. For months I tried. He pushed the paper toward Rafe. That's all I can do. I'm sorry it isn't more. Waya looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled behind her. It is more than nothing, she said, finally. Not warmly, but true. He stood up, left the coffee half-finished, walked to the door, stopped. Aldridge is planning something, he said without turning around. I don't know what or when, but he's been in contact with men from Cheyenne. Not ranchers, not traders. A pause. Whatever you're going to do, don't wait until March. He went out into the cold. They listened to his footsteps going down the road. Waya picked up the paper. Read it slowly. Set it down. How far to the next county over, she said. 40 miles south. Harder Pass settlement. Does a federal judge ever travel through? Calloway goes to Cheyenne after Ridgefall. His route. Rafe stopped. Thought. His route goes south through Harder Pass. If he left Ridgefall going south, he'd pass through Harder Pass. Settlement. She looked at him. So we don't have to wait for March, she said. We'd have to know when he was leaving Ridgefall. Doc Haskell would know. Rafe looked at the paper Greer had left. Looked at the folded packet of Aldridge's documents. Looked at her. It's still January, he said. Calloway doesn't come to Ridgefall until March, so we go to him, she said. Wherever he is before Ridgefall. Rafe spread the paper on the table. Thought about distances. Thought about February roads. Thought about leaving the ranch long enough too. I have to go alone, he said. She looked up sharply. You can't go with me, he said. If you're recognized on the road, if you go alone, Aldridge will come here while you're gone. I know. They looked at each other. I can handle myself, she said. I know that too. He met her eyes. That's not what worries me. A beat. Then what worries you, she said. He looked at the table. That he'll do something before I get back, he said. That I won't be here. The fire between them, the lamp. The sound of wind on the roof. The specific silence of two people who have arrived at a place in a conversation where the words have stopped being about logistics. I was on a ridge when my village burned, she said quietly. I was not there. I could not stop it. She looked at him. You understand what I am telling you? Yes, he said. Some things happen whether we are present or not. Her voice was steady. You cannot prevent everything by staying. No, he said. But I can make it harder for him. She looked at the papers. He looked at her, and then, because the moment required honesty, and he was a man who, when pushed to it, preferred honesty to comfort, he said, I don't want to go. That's the truth. I don't want to leave this ranch, and I don't. He stopped. Chose the next words carefully. I don't want to leave while you're in it. She was very still, Rafe. She said, I know, he said, I know. We don't have to. He shook his head. Forget I said it. I'm not going to forget you said it, then. I'm just not ready to answer it yet. He looked at her. At the serious, careful, undeflecting way she was looking back. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. And somehow. That was enough. For now. Enough. Then the fire came. Not from the west side where he'd worried about the old barn wood. From the east, the haystack beside the coop, bone dry from weeks of cold. Someone had set it deliberate. He could tell by the way it caught. Too fast. Too even. Too confident. He smelled it first, smoke, and then orange light against the bedroom ceiling. And he was out of bed and downstairs and outside before he was fully awake. The stack was already fully burning. The heat, even from 20 yards away, was aggressive. The chickens inside the coop were panicking, and the wind, the January wind, was carrying sparks northeast toward the barn, toward the horses. I ran. Waya was already there. He didn't know how. She'd come out of the house from the other door, already had a bucket from the water trough that wasn't fully frozen yet, already throwing it at the base of the stack, already calculating wind direction and making decisions about which part to contain first. She wasn't looking at the fire. She was looking at the gaps. Barn, she said, without looking at him. He went. He got the horses out first. All 5. Turned them into the far pasture where the fence would hold. Ghost was last, calmer than the others, stepping out through the smoke with that white horse composure that Clara had loved. He went back for the tools, then back to help Waya. They worked for 2 hours, not talking, not needing to, trading buckets from the trough and from the pump, slow callow, the pump needing to be coaxed between uses. The wind changed direction twice. She caught both changes before he did, and redirected the containment line without a word, and he followed her lead because she was right. The stack burned down to nothing. The coop survived. 2 fence posts on the east side were charred but standing. The barn had a scorch mark on but nothing structural. When it was done, they stood in the dark and the cold and the smoke. His coat was soaked through from the pump water. Her hair had come loose from the braid. They were both black-handed from the smoke and breathing hard. He looked at the damage. She looked at the damage. "He's escalating," she said. "Yes." This was a warning. She looked at the charred fence posts. Next time it won't be a warning. He looked at the remains of the haystack, at the perfect circle of where it had caught, at the specific location, visible from the road, from the south, easy to approach, easy to set, easy to walk away from into the dark. "He's testing what I'll do," Rafe said. "What will you do?" He looked at her. She was watching him, black-handed, hair loose, serious as the cold. "I'm going to find Judge Calloway," he said, "before Aldridge decides the next test should be the house." She held his gaze. "When?" she said. "Day after tomorrow. I need 1 day to make sure the ranch is ready to be left." He paused. "And I need to know I'll be here when you get back," she said. Flat, final. Not a reassurance. A statement of what was going to happen. He believed her. He couldn't entirely say why. 6 weeks ago, he'd opened a door in a blizzard to a stranger. And somewhere in the weeks between that night and this one, in the barn work, and the evening fires, and the rabbit stew, and the almost smiles, and the things said, and the things not said, somewhere in all of that, he had started to believe her, not because she'd earned it, because she was Waya. And that was enough. He didn't say any of that. He said, "All right," she said. "Good." They went back inside. The fire in the grate had burned low while they were outside. He added wood. She put the coffee on. They sat down on opposite sides of the kitchen, hands still black, coats still wet. And the coffee when it came was the best thing he could remember tasting in a long time. Possibly because everything was going to get harder before it got easier. Possibly because mornings after a hard night always make coffee taste like it means something. Possibly for other reasons he was still not quite ready to say out loud. Outside, the smoke had cleared on the January wind. The horses were in the far pasture. The barn was standing. The house was still. But the ground was charred on the east side, and Aldridge was somewhere south, doing math, and March was still far away, but Harder Pass was only 40 miles. He left before dawn, not because he was afraid to say goodbye, because goodbyes in the dark are easier than goodbyes in the light. In the light, you see everything too clearly. The expression on a person's face, the way they hold themselves when they're trying not to show what they're feeling. The specific quality of a morning that might be the last ordinary one for a while. In the dark, you just go. He'd packed the night before. Light pack, hard biscuits, dried meat. Clara's old saddlebag, the good one, the one he hadn't touched in 3 years. He'd picked it up without thinking, then stood there a moment holding it, then packed it anyway. Some things you use because they're the best you have, not because you've stopped feeling what they meant. His rifle, his good coat, the copy he'd made, by hand, letter by letter, laid into 2 nights this week, of the most important sections of Aldridge's documents. Because Waya was keeping the originals, and he wasn't going south with the only copies of the only evidence they had. He saddled Dutch quietly, didn't take a lamp into the barn, knew the space well enough by feel. Each horses breathing in the dark, Pepper shifting in her stall, Ghost standing absolutely still the way he always did. Like he was made of snow and patience. He was almost out when he heard the door, soft. The specific sound of someone who is also trying not to make noise. Waya stood at the barn entrance. She'd wrapped a blanket around her shoulders over the deerskin. Her hair was loose. She hadn't braided it yet, which meant she'd come out fast, without preparation, which meant she'd been awake and waiting for the sound of him moving, which meant she'd been awake. He held Dutch's reins and looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she walked forward and held out her hand in her palm, a small piece of dried sage tied with a strip of her own deerskin fringe. The knot was the same kind she used on everything. Tight, precise, made to hold. For the road, she said. He took it. Looked at it in his palm. Apache custom, he said, Dom. Common sense, she said. Sage keeps your head clear. You'll need that, he almost smiled. Almost. The shape of it was there. I'll be back in 4 days, he said. Maybe 5, I know. If Aldridge comes, I know, Waya. Rafe. She looked at him steady. Go find the judge. I'll be here. He looked at her one more time in the dark barn. At the blanket, at the loose hair, at the talisman, catching the faint pre-dawn light that came through the gaps in the wall. He said, Don't take any chances, she said. I take calculated ones. He mounted Dutch, rode south into the dark, and didn't look back. Because if he looked back, he would stop. And stopping was not something they could afford. The road to Harder Pass was 40 miles of Wyoming, doing what Wyoming does in January. Which is everything it can to make you reconsider your choices. The wind came off the mountains from the northwest and hit him sideways for the first 15 miles. Then the road dropped into a valley, and the wind dropped with it, and he had an hour of almost quiet. Just Dutch's hooves on frozen ground, and the specific sound of cold air moving through bare cottonwood branches. Like the land breathing through its teeth, he thought about Waya the whole way. Not strategically, not usefully. Just thought about her. The way you think about something that has taken up residence in a space you forgot was empty. 3 years ago, this ranch, this road, this territory, not empty of work, not empty of function, but empty of the thing that makes function matter. The second voice. The second perspective. The second pair of hands that reaches for the right tool before you've said which one you need. He hadn't known how empty until it wasn't. That was the thing about emptiness. You adapt to it. You arranged your life around the shape of what was missing. Until the missing thing became the new architecture. You stopped noticing the silence, because the silence had become the house, and then someone knocked on your door in a blizzard, and said 4 words, and walked through. And suddenly, the silence was just silence again. Not a structure, not a home. Just the absence of sound, which is a very different thing. He rode, he thought. He kept the sage in his coat pocket and touched it twice without meaning to. Harder Pass was smaller than Ridgefall, 30 people maybe. A trading post. A church that doubled as everything else. A livery that smelled strongly of its own history. He asked at the trading post about Judge Calloway. The man behind the counter, wide, suspicious, the type who treated strangers as problems to be resolved, looked at him for a long moment. What do you want with the judge? Legal matter, Rafe said. What kind? The kind that needs a federal judge. A pause. The man looked at his coat, at the saddlebag, at the specific posture of a man who has ridden 40 miles in January and is not in the mood for obstruction. He's at the church, the man said. Has been 2 days. Waiting out a storm system before he heads to Ridgefall. Rafe left Dutch at the livery, walked to the church. Judge Calloway was 60 years old and had the face of a man who had spent 30 of those years listening to people lie to him and had developed a very specific tolerance for it. He was sitting in the front pew with a cup of coffee and a stack of papers when Rafe walked in. He looked up over his reading glasses. Mr. Colton. Rafe Colton. Wind River Basin. Calloway looked at him. You rode from Wind River Basin? Yes. In January? Yes. Calloway took his glasses off, set them on the papers. Looked at Rafe the way a man looks at someone who has done something either very brave or very stupid, and is reserving judgment on which. Sit down, Mr. Colton, he said, and tell me why. So Rafe sat down. In a church in Harder Pass, Wyoming in January, 40 miles from the ranch where Waya was alone, with a stack of documents and a man circling her like bad weather, and he told the judge everything. He started with the night she knocked on the door, not because it was the legally relevant beginning, but because it was the true beginning. And he had decided somewhere on that 40-mile road that the only strategy that made sense was the truth. All of it. Without management, Calloway listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't take notes. Just listened with the specific attention of a man who has trained himself to hear what's between the words, not just the words themselves. Rafe talked for a long time, the village, the documents. The knife wound, the 6 weeks she'd been moving before she reached his door. Aldridge's visit, the notices in Ridgefall, Doc Haskell, Deputy Greer and his piece of paper, the fire in the haystack, the land claims, all of it. When he finished, the church was quiet. Calloway picked up his glasses, put them back on. Looked at the window. Aldridge, he said. Victor Aldridge. Aldridge Land and Cattle. I know who he is. Calloway's voice was level. I've had dealings with his lawyers. He is a man who is very careful about paper trails. A pause. If the documents you're describing are what you say they are, then they're the first concrete evidence I've seen of what people have been suggesting about his operation. For 2 years. He looked at Rafe. Where are the originals? With her. At the ranch, Calloway was quiet for a moment. You left them with her. She survived 6 weeks in Wyoming winter with those papers, Rafe said. They're safer with her than anywhere else. Calloway looked at him for a moment. Something moved in the judge's expression. Not admiration exactly, more like recognition. The recognition of a man who has met very few people willing to stake their position on a statement like that. And you have copies, Calloway said. Rafe opened his saddlebag. Set the handwritten copies on the pew between them. Calloway looked at them. Picked up the first page. Read, ride the second, the third. He set them down carefully. I'll need to see the originals, he said. And the woman. Her testimony. He looked at Rafe, and Deputy Greer's statement. If he'll give one formally, he said he wouldn't. People say a lot of things. Before they're standing in front of a federal judge, Calloway folded the copies and put them in his own coat pocket. I wasn't planning to leave for Ridgefall until next week. Storm system, I know, Rafe said. I need you to come sooner because Aldridge is planning something. I don't know what. I know the timeline is moving, Calloway looked at him. You rode 40 miles in January, he said. For a woman you've known 2 months. Rafe looked back at him. Yes, he said. A pause. All right, Mr. Colton, Calloway said. He stood up. I'll leave tomorrow morning. He rode back in 3 days instead of 4. Hard riding. Cold nights. Dutch unhappy about the pace but willing, because Dutch was always willing in the end, which was why he was the horse Rafe rode when things mattered. He was 12 miles out from the ranch when he saw the smoke, small smoke. Not fire smoke, chimney smoke, normal. He released the breath he'd been holding since Harder Pass, normal. She was fine, he told himself that. He rode the last 12 miles anyway, like the devil was behind him. She was in the barn, of course she was in the barn. Because where else would Waya be at 4 in the afternoon when there was work to be done? She was restitching the harness again. The same one. The one she'd set down when Doc Haskell came, and never quite finished. He noticed that, the way she kept coming back to unfinished things. The way she didn't abandon work just because it got interrupted. She looked up when he led Dutch in. Her face did the thing it sometimes did, that involuntary shift. The one she tried to control and didn't always succeed at, something in him settled. You're back, she said. I'm back. 4 days, 3. She looked at him. At Dutch. At the mud on his coat from a creek crossing south of the ridge. He'll come to the ranch, Rafe said. Calloway. He's going to Ridgefall first, and then he wants the originals and your testimony. She set the harness down. He believed you? He believed the copies. He wants the originals. Rafe unsaddled Dutch, started rubbing him down. He said he's been building a case on Aldridge for 2 years without enough to act on. These documents, he stopped. These documents are enough. She was quiet. He looked at her. Why, I know, she said. It's good. It's what we needed. She looked at the harness in her hands. It's just, she stopped. What? If he reads them. If the judge acts. She looked up. What happens after? He kept rubbing Dutch down. What do you mean? The land, she said. Even if Aldridge is stopped, even if his claims are overturned, she set the harness on the rail. There is no one left of my people on that land. Her voice was steady, the way it was always steady, right up until the words underneath started showing through. I am the only one who knows which creek runs where, which hills were named what, which trees were marked. She looked at her hands. What does it mean to save land when there is no one left to live on it? The barn was quiet. He finished with Dutch, came and stood near her. Not close enough to crowd, just present. It means there's a record, he said. That what happened. Happened. That someone said it was wrong. That the land has a name that isn't Aldridge's. She looked at him. That's not nothing, he said. I know it's not everything, but it's not nothing. She was quiet for a long time. No, she said finally. It's not nothing. He picked up the harness, handed it back to her. She took it, looked at the stitching she'd been doing. He came. She said. Rafe went still. Aldridge, she said. Yesterday, he turned to look at her. With 2 men, she said. He knocked this time. I came to the door but didn't open it. Spoke through the wood. He was careful about that. He didn't push past. A man like Aldridge doesn't force doors when he thinks he can still win with words. She picked the harness back up. Her jaw tightened, which told him more than a smile would have. He was very polite. He said he'd heard you'd gone south. He said he wanted to offer me an alternative to whatever I thought I was doing. What did he offer? Money. A new name. Safe passage out of the territory. She set the harness down again. He said he didn't want to hurt me. That this had all been a misunderstanding. That he was willing to be generous if I was willing to be reasonable. And you said. She looked at him directly. I told him the documents were already with a federal judge, she said. Rafe blinked. That was not true yet, he said. I know. She picked the harness back up, but it needed to be true soon. So I made it true in his head first. He looked at her. What did he do? He smiled, the way he always smiles. Like he's storing the information. She started stitching. Then he left. He believed you? He believed enough of it to want to know for certain. She didn't look up. He'll move soon. Today or tomorrow. Rafe looked at the barn door. At the light coming through. Late afternoon light, already going orange and thin. How much time do we have? He said. Less than we want, she said. More than you think. He nodded, picked up his saddlebag. Then, we need to be ready, he said. The next morning arrived gray and heavy. Cold pressing down on the ranch like a palm on a table. Everything too still. The horses knew it first. Ghost standing at the far end of his stall, facing the door. Pepper pulling at her lead. That animal sense of something in the air that hadn't arranged itself into events yet. But Wood Rafe was at the fence line on the west side, checking the post that had been worrying him since the last storm, when he heard Dutch snort, sharp. Once he looked up 4 riders, coming from the south road, not fast, measured. The pace of men who had already decided what was going to hike at Hempenhan and were giving themselves time to feel good about it. Aldridge at the front, 3 men behind him. Rafe set down the fencing tool, walked back toward the house. Even, unhurried. Not running, because running would look like something, and he didn't want to look like something. Waya was on the porch when he got there. She'd seen them too. She had the documents in her hands, the originals. The whole packet inside, he said. No, she looked at the riders. I'm not going to stand behind a door again. He looked at her. She looked back. He stood beside her on the porch. Aldridge rode up to the gate and stopped. His 3 men spread slightly behind him. A calculated arrangement, wide enough to be noticed, close enough to move fast. Aldridge looked at Rafe, at Waya, at the documents in Waya's hands. His face did nothing, which was worse than anger, Mr. Colton, he said. I'd hoped we could conclude this quietly. You set fire to my haystack, Rafe said. That wasn't quiet. I don't know what you're referring to. Yes, you do. A pause. Aldridge looked at the documents in Waya's hands. Those papers, he said, belong to my company. These papers, Waya said, have your signature on land contracts that were never agreed to. By people who were never asked. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. I think a judge would find that interesting. Aldridge looked at her. You spoke to Rafe's contact yesterday, she said. About an offer. Her voice was absolutely level. I'm telling you now. There is no offer. There was no misunderstanding. You know what you did. I know what you did. And in about 3 days, a federal judge will know what you did. Something moved across Aldridge's face. Not the smile this time. Something underneath the smile. What had always been underneath the smile. The judge, he said. Judge Calloway, Rafe said. He's on his way from Harder Pass. The 3 men behind Aldridge shifted, small movements. The kind that precede larger ones. Aldridge looked at Rafe. You rode to Harder Pass. I did. In January. Yes. A long pause. You did that for her, Aldridge said. Not a question. The tone of a man trying to understand a calculation that doesn't add up for him. I did that. For what's right, Rafe said, which happens to include her. Aldridge looked between them, at the way they were standing. At the specific distance and the specific alignment of 2 people who have stood next to each other. Enough times to do it without thinking. Something crossed his face. Calculation colliding with something more personal. She has nothing, Aldridge said. And now there was an edge in the smooth voice. No village. No family. No land that's legally hers under any title this territory recognizes. He looked at Wyatt directly. You survived. I'll grant you that. But surviving isn't winning. Wyatt looked at him. Completely. Still, my people don't use that word, she said. Winning. It's a word for people who think the earth belongs to whoever grabs it fastest. She lifted the document slightly. These say you grabbed. They say the dates, the names, the amounts. Her eyes didn't move. History is made of paper, Mr. Aldridge. You taught me that, actually. You brought the paper. I just kept it. Aldridge stared at her. Then he looked at the man on his left, and that was the moment. Rafe saw it, the micro. Decision. The millisecond in which Aldridge calculated what happened next if he let this go forward, and what happened next if he didn't, and chose. The man on the left moved first, but Rafe was already moving, not for his rifle, because the rifle was inside and there was no time. Because a man who spent 20 years on a working ranch knows how to move fast, over uneven ground, and how to put himself between something and what it's heading for. He stepped in front of Wyatt. The man pulled up short, not from conscience, from the specific fact of a body in the way. A body that had made a decision and was communicating that decision with every line of its posture. Come through me first. The man looked at Aldridge. Aldridge looked at Rafe. And into that held moment, hoofbeats from the North Road. 3 horses, moving fast. Locke Haskell was in the lead, which would have been funny under other circumstances. Doc Haskell, with his 65-year-old knees and his careful wagon climbing and his reputation for deliberate movement, was in the lead of 3 horses coming down the North Road at a pace that said someone had convinced him urgency was more important than his joints. Behind him, Deputy Greer in his uniform this time, and behind Greer, a third man Rafe didn't recognize, older, heavy wool coat. The specific posture of someone accustomed to being the most important person in a room and not needing to down to announce it. Judge Calloway had not waited 3 days. Locke Haskell pulled up outside the gate, looked at the arrangement, at Aldridge, at his 3 men, at Rafe standing in front of Wyatt, with no rifle and a very clear position. Well, Doc Haskell said, breathing hard. We made good time. Calloway brought his horse up beside him. Looked at the scene with the expression of a man who has seen many configurations of conflict and can read them the way a rancher reads weather. He looked at Aldridge. Victor Aldridge, he said. Aldridge looked at the judge, and for the first time, just for a moment, the smooth face showed what was underneath it. Calculation meeting an obstacle it hadn't planned for. Judge Calloway, Aldridge said. Still smooth, still controlled, only the eyes giving away anything. I wasn't aware you were in the territory. I made a schedule adjustment. Calloway dismounted, slowly, with the dignity of a man who knew he didn't need to hurry. I've been informed of some concerns regarding land transactions in this area. I'd like to review relevant documentation. He looked at Wyatt. Are you the woman holding the Aldridge Company documents? Yes, Waya said. And you came by them how? I took them, she said. From a saddlebag. In my village. Before the men he hired burned it, Calloway looked at Aldridge. Is this property your ranch, Mr. Colton? He said. It is, Rafe said. And these men came here uninvited? They did. Calloway looked at the three men behind Aldridge. At the arrangement of them. At the man who had started to move and stopped when Rafe stepped in the way. I see, he said. He walked toward the gate. Aldridge moved his horse slightly. Calloway stopped. Looked up at him. The two men looked at each other. Whatever Aldridge saw in the judge's face, it was enough. He pulled his horse back. Calloway came through the gate. Deputy Greer tied his horse and followed the judge in. He didn't look at Aldridge, which was its own kind of answer. Doc Haskell came last. As he passed through the gate, he looked at Rafe with the expression of a man who has just done the most frightening thing he's done in 20 years and is currently operating on the other side of it. You're welcome, Doc, Haskell said quietly. How did you get him here early? Rafe said. I sent a telegram from Ridgefall to Harder Pass. 2 days ago, Doc Haskell said. The morning after you left. I figured you were going to find him and you'd need him to move fast. A pause. I also figured if Aldridge's people in Ridgefall saw the telegram, it would not take long for Aldridge himself to know the judge was coming. He glanced back at Aldridge, still on his horse outside the gate. Better he know the judge is here than think he has time to. He stopped. Well, what he was apparently planning to do this morning. Rafe looked at him. You're not as uninvested as you look, Rafe said. I'm a doctor, Doc Haskell said. I spent my life trying to fix things that didn't need to happen in the first place. He looked at Waya. This didn't need to happen. She looked at him. No, she said. It didn't. He nodded. They all went inside. Aldridge stayed outside. His three men stayed with him. Rafe watched from the kitchen window while Calloway sat at the table and Waya laid the documents out one by one and walked the judge through each of them. Her voice was clear, unhurried. She pointed to dates, to signatures, to the survey marks that matched the land her people had lived on for 3 generations. Calloway read. He read everything. He asked 3 questions, precise, all of them precise. All of them answered precisely. Then he looked at Deputy Greer. Your statement, he said. Greer sat at the table. He was holding his hat in his hands, turning it. Around and around. I was in Crane's Fork, he said. September, last year. I heard Aldridge discuss the arrangements. With men he hired, he stopped. Looked at his hat. I have notes. I made them that evening. He reached into his coat. Set the paper on the table. I should have come forward then. Yes, Calloway said. You should have. Greer nodded. Said nothing. Calloway looked at the paper. At the documents. At Waya, this is sufficient for me to open a formal investigation, he said, which will include a temporary injunction on any land transfers filed by Aldridge Land and Cattle in this territory, pending review. He folded his hands. It is a beginning. I understand, Waya said. The land itself, the Apache land to the northeast. He paused. The legal process for that is longer and more complicated. I won't give you false certainty about the outcome. I know, she said. What I can do, he said, is make sure the record exists, that there is a file with a date and signatures and evidence. That what happened is documented in a court that is not owned by Victor Aldridge. She was quiet. That matters, she said finally. It does, he said, slowly. But it does, he stood, walked to the door, opened it. Aldridge was still there. Calloway walked out onto the porch. Mr. Aldridge, he said, I'm placing a temporary injunction on all your land operations in Wind River Basin and the surrounding area, effective immediately. I'll need you to accompany me to Ridgefall, where I'll be establishing a formal record. He looked at the 3 men. You're welcome to bring whoever you like. So am I. Aldridge looked at the judge, looked at his 3 men, looked at the door of the ranch house where Rafe was standing, and then at Waya, just visible behind Rafe's shoulder. He looked at her for a long time. Whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it. Because what was there was not fear. and was not victory, was something quite quieter than both. Was a woman who had been surviving for so long she'd forgotten that surviving and living were different things. And was just now, slowly, in this specific moment, beginning to remember. Aldridge turned his horse. He didn't say anything else. He rode south. His 3 men followed. Calloway watched them go, then looked back at Rafe. "I'll need her in Ridgefall in 3 days," he said, "to sign the formal statement. She'll be there," Rafe said. Calloway looked at him for a moment. "You rode 40 miles in January," he said, again. Like the first time hadn't finished settling. "Yes," Rafe said. Again, the judge almost smiled, almost. He went to get his horse. The afternoon went quiet, the way afternoons go quiet after something that's been building for a long time finally finishes, not resolved exactly, not clean, but over, at least for now, at least this particular version of it. Doc Haskell stayed for coffee. Deputy Greer stayed for a while too, not saying much, sitting at the edge of the kitchen with his hat in his lap, and the look of a man who has put something down that he'd been carrying so long it had started to feel like part of his body. Eventually, they both left. Dutch was in his stall. The other horses had calmed down. The fire in the kitchen grate was good and steady. Outside, the winter was doing Wyoming winterlight does in the late afternoon, going sideways and gold and making everything look like it had always been exactly this way. Rafe stood at the kitchen window. Waya was at the table, not doing anything, just sitting, which was unusual for her. Sitting still without a task was something he'd almost never seen her do. He got the coffee pot, poured for both of them, sat down. They sat for a while. "He'll fight it," Waya said. "Not urgently." "Just stating he will," Rafe said. The legal process Calloway mentioned. Long and complicated. She looked at the coffee. That could mean years. It could. Things don't always resolve the way they should. She looked at the window. "Even with evidence." "No," he said. "They don't. Always." She was quiet. "But the record exists now," he said. "Like he said. Your village's name. The land. The dates. It exists in a file that Aldridge can't get to." He looked at her. "That's not nothing. You said that before. I'll probably say it again." The corner of her mouth. There it was, the thing he watched for. He sat with his coffee and watched it happen and felt something he recognized now. The specific warmth of a thing you've been waiting for without letting yourself know you were waiting. "What will you do?" he said, "after Ridgefall." After the statement, she looked at her coffee. "I don't know," she said. "Honest. Simple. For 6 weeks I had one thing to do. Move. Survive. Get the papers to someone who could use them." She looked at the window. "I don't have a plan after that." "You could stay," he said. She looked at him. "Not because you have nowhere to go," he said quickly. "I know you could go. I know you could survive anywhere. You've demonstrated that very clearly." He looked at the table. "I mean because you could choose this. If you wanted it." She was quiet. He was quiet. The fire behind them. The horses outside. The gold light coming in sideways through the window. "Clara's room," she said. "It doesn't have to be Clara's room," he said. "It could just be a room." She looked at him. "That's a very small distinction," she said. "Or it's a very large one. Depending." She held his gaze. "Depending on what?" she said. He looked at her. "Straight. Depending on whether you're staying because you have nowhere else," he said. "Or because you want this place specifically. This ranch. This." He stopped. Chose the word carefully. "This." A long pause, the kind of pause that has weight. That means something is being decided. She looked at the window. At the late light. At the snow on the hills that had been there since she arrived and would be there for another month at least. "When I was on the ridge," she said. "The night the village burned." She looked at her hands. "I stood there and I watched and I couldn't." She stopped. "I couldn't go down, and I couldn't look away, and I couldn't do anything except understand that everything I knew was ending, and I had no idea what came after." He listened. "I ran," she said, "because running was something. Because moving meant I was still." She touched the talisman. Still there. Still a person who existed. She looked at him. I kept running, because stopping felt like dying, and I told myself, when this is over, when the papers are with someone who can use them, then I'll stop. He waited. This is over, she said. Yes, he said, and I stopped, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long time, not the measuring look, not the hawk watching the ground look. Something else. Something she hadn't shown him before. Something that was closer to the actual inside of her than anything she'd let him see yet. I'm tired, she said. Not body tired. Tired in a place that sleep doesn't reach. I know that tired, he said. I know you do. A pause. I like this house, she said, carefully. I like the way the fire sounds. I like that ghost is in the barn. I like that you don't fill silence with words that don't mean anything. She looked at the table. I like that you rode 40 miles in January. He didn't say anything. I like, she said. Slower, that you put a chair beside the fire, and you don't ask me to explain myself in it. He looked at her. The chair's still there, he said. She looked at him. I know, she said, but she didn't sit in it that night. Not yet. Some things needed a little more time to be true. She went to Ridgefall 3 days later. He rode with her, not because she needed him to. She'd made it very clear, in several ways over the course of several days, that she did not need him to do things for her, and he had come to understand that this was not a defensive statement, but a factual one, and that the right response was to believe it. He rode with her because she was going to Ridgefall, and he was going to Ridgefall, separately and simultaneously, for separate but compatible reasons. He needed more flour. She needed to sign a statement for a federal judge. These things were not incompatible. She did not comment on his sudden need for flour, which was its own kind of commentary. Ridgefall looked the same. It always looked the same. Small and permanent and slightly suspicious of everything. The notices were gone from the board outside Ted Pemberton's. Calloway had taken them down the afternoon he arrived. The town had the specific feel of a place where something large had happened, and everyone was still deciding what to think about it. Pemberton looked at Rafe when he came in, then looked at Waya behind him. He didn't say anything, just started pulling Rafe's order. Then he looked at Waya again. You want coffee? He said, to her. Like it required an effort. She looked at him. Yes, she said. He poured it, set it on the counter. Said nothing else, which was not much, but was more than nothing. She was in Calloway's office for 2 hours. Rafe waited outside with the horses. He had the flour. He had no reason to stay outside Calloway's office, except that he didn't want to be somewhere else. So he stayed. When she came out, she stood on the step for a moment. Let the cold air hit her face. Her eyes were clear, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that suggested the last 2 hours had required something. How was it? He said. He asked good questions, she said. He listened. A pause. It's the first time I've told the whole thing to someone with the authority to write it down. He looked at her. How does that feel? He said. She thought about it. Like putting something heavy down, she said. And not being sure your arms know what to do without the weight. He nodded. Dutch shifted beside him. Flour, she said. Yes, you didn't need flour. I definitely needed flour. She looked at him. You stayed outside for 2 hours because of flour, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then, thank you. Simple. Direct. The way she said everything. You're welcome. Simple. Direct. The way he'd learned to match her. They rode home. That evening, the house held a quality different from every evening before it. Not louder. Not brighter. Just different. The way a room changes when the thing that needed to happen finally has. The way air feels after a storm breaks. He made dinner. She sat at the table with a cup of tea and didn't offer to help, which was new, which meant she was tired in the way that goes past practicality. He put the food in front of her. She ate. He ate. The fire crackled. After a while, she said, my grandmother used to say, the talisman knows. She turned it on her wrist. She meant, the body knows before the mind admits it. You feel things before you understand them. She looked at the carved feather, she said. Put it down when you find where you belong. Not where you're staying." He didn't move. "I carried it for a long time," she said. "Through the village, through the fire, through 6 weeks of Wyoming." She looked at it. "I carried it because it was all I had left of her, and because I hadn't found the place." She set it down on the table, between them. He looked at it, the talisman, bone white, carved into a feather, worn smooth from years of hands. The kind of object that contains more history than its size suggests. The kind of object that has been held in moments of grief and terror and small, ordinary mornings and all the time in between. "Waya, I'm not giving it to you," she said. "I'm putting it down." She looked at him. "There's a difference, I know," he said. Without looking away from the talisman on the table, he went to get the box, Clara's box. The cedar one from the storage room. He'd been meaning to get it for 2 weeks and kept finding reasons not to. Because the box meant something. Because opening it was a thing you did when you were ready, and he'd been deciding whether he was ready. And tonight, something in him said, "Yes, now." This, he set it on the table, opened it. The letter was on top, folded. His name in Clara's handwriting on the outside. He picked it up, held it for a moment, set it on the table in front of Waya. She looked at it. "I read it," he said. "A few weeks ago. First time he looked at his hands. She wrote it before she died. Doc Haskell gave it to me after, and I couldn't." He stopped. "I wasn't ready. What does it say?" she said. He could have handed it to her, could have let her read it herself. Instead, she said, "Don't close the door." She said, "Keep it open." She said, "Someone will need it, and so will you." Waya looked at the letter, then at him. "She shit rot that," Waya said. Before she knew. Yes, before she knew any of this. Yes, she was quiet. "She was telling you about me," she said. "Except she didn't know it." "That's what I think too," he said. She picked up the letter, held it carefully. The way she held everything, with exact and particular attention. She read it, set it back down, and then Waya, who did not cry, who had walked 6 weeks through a Wyoming winter, with a knife wound in her side, and a stack of evidence against a powerful man, and everything she'd ever known turned to ash behind her. Waya put her face in her hands and let go of something she'd been holding since September. He didn't move toward her. He didn't say anything. Because there are moments that require presence, not intervention. Moments that have to be allowed to be what they are, without being managed or comforted or redirected. Clara had taught him that. It had taken him a long time to learn it. He'd learned it eventually. He sat with her while she let it go. After a while, a long while, she lifted her face. Her eyes were red. Her face was its usual composed self, except for the red eyes, and a single track of moisture she didn't bother to wipe. "She sounds like she was someone worth knowing," Waya said. "She was," he said. "She was right," she said. "About the door." Yes, she looked at the talisman on the table, picked it up, and set it back down again. "Still putting it down," she said, almost to herself. "Okay," he said. "Started. It doesn't have to mean anything yet," he said. She looked at him. "But eventually," she said. Eventually, he agreed. She picked up her tea. He added wood to the fire. The January night settled around the ranch. Cold outside, warm inside. The horses in the barn, Ghost standing somewhere in the dark with that white horse patience of his. The documents in Calloway's office now. The record made. The beginning of something that would take a long time and might not end the way it should and might end better than expected. Because that was the nature of things in the territory, and in the law, and in the slow, grinding movement of what is right, trying to become what is. He pulled the chair closer to the fire, not Clara's chair, the other one. Waya sat in it. He sat in the house, which had been silent in the way that silence can be a kind of dying, was quiet instead. Which is a different thing. Kie is what happens when the right people are in the same room, and no one needs to fill the space. Kie is what happens after. After the storm. After the running. After the 40-mile ride, and the burning haystack and the man at the gate who looked at 2 people standing together and couldn't understand why that was worth more than $200 and everything he was offering. Quiet is what the winter left behind when it finally slowly started to become something else. Outside, the snow on the Wind River hills was the same, but inside the Colton Ranch, something had been put down, and something had been kept open, and the fire burned until morning.